All right, good folks. I'm delighted that you're here, that you have chosen to spend your Friday night full moon with me. Trying to get this out of the way. I don't think it's going to let me. All right, let's go back. So this is a lightning round, history and polity, disciples, cultural context. This is where we'll start the historical roots and theological tradition. And like I mentioned to Renee, I am teaching this course at PSR in the spring for a semester. And if you're interested in learning more about this than we're able to get to tonight, then you're welcome to come and take the course. You can take it for credit, you can audit. There are some options. And my email is here. I don't know if you can fully see it, cmnewton@earthlink.net. And I'm also the pastor at the First Christian Church in Vallejo. You can also reach me there if you have additional questions. But we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the historical roots of the disciples movement, some key figures, some theological traditions and ideas that have helped shape the history and the identity of the Christian church, disciples of Christ, some of the structures and organizations and expressions of the Christian church, disciples of Christ, some of the things that we hang on to as part of our identity, like unity and diversity, those kinds of things. And so we will begin with with Alexander Campbell, one of our founders, who has said, and I hope you can see as much of this as possible, we commence our career as a church under the banner of the Bible, the whole Bible, and nothing but the Bible as the standard of our religious faith and practice. We have our own opinions, but these we shall hold as private property. The faith is common. Our inferences and opinions are our own. If our brother asks for them, we may tender them, but must not force him to accept them. Christians are the sons of liberty, the Lord's freed men. The right to choose and to refuse the opinions of men is the essence of liberty. We are a weak band, a humble beginning, but so much the better. So were they of Galilee, and such were the founders of this great nation. So as we begin tonight, we begin with the questions: who are we? For what have we here convened? The cultural context for the development of the Christian church, disciples of Christ. I kind of boil this down to 5 things: thought, sentiment, geography, spirituality, and tradition. And there are some specific things that have helped develop and sort of set the stage for the movement that we are and that we continue. The thought, we are grounded in this Enlightenment rationality, the sentiment, revolutionary commitment, geography, the changing frontiers and limitations, the spirituality, the Second Great Awakening, and the tradition, the Cane Ridge sacramental occasion. And we'll spend some time with these things. But this is a lightning round, so we're going to go pretty fast. So in terms of thought, Enlightenment rationality, so based primarily in reason and rationality. Deism, this idea that was championed largely by Thomas Jefferson about the clock, the great clockmaker winds it up and lets it go. And then it's up to human beings. Rousseau, who was the champion of the idea of religion in terms of human needs, not divine truths. This deeply entwined idea that religion is connected with moral experience, that morality is inseparable from politics. So hear that again: morality is inseparable from politics. And John Locke, who championed religious liberty, which was used to challenge religious leadership in America, the value and freedom of the individual, democratic ideals. No one has the right to impose a belief upon another. The idea that the church was a voluntary society and faith was an intellectual act. So there was an intellectual goal here to emancipate people from the tyranny of the church. That was part of the development of this movement. There was a popular legend in the 19th century that traveling evangelists, including Walter Scott, who was one of the founders of the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, that these traveling evangelists carried 3 publications in their saddlebags: a Bible, a hymnal, and Locke's second treatise on government. They were very entrenched, very deeply enmeshed with this Enlightenment rationality. The sentiment that helps form the cultural context was revolutionary. There was a commitment to that. So you have the American Revolution, which was sandwiched in between the English Revolution and the French Revolution. Okay, and the ideas that motivated these revolutions were the ideals of liberty and equality and democracy and universality. So as opposed to monarchy and aristocracy and ecclesial authority, male dominance, theological control of education and what we think. So there was a real resistance to that. That was part of this revolutionary mindset. And there was a willingness to fight for beliefs and values. And that the country, that the United States, and if you haven't sensed already, the development of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ was very much connected to the development of this country. It developed on this soil sort of parallel to the development of the United States of America. And the country was created to be religiously neutral. It was the first government in the world established not on the authority of religion, but on the foundation of human reason. And so there was a sort of religious deregulation involved in the development of our church and the country. And then you have the changing geography, the broadening of frontiers and limitations. Now, you get it in terms of manifest destiny, which you know about, right? You know, this, we are destined to take over this land, which has a lot of problematic aspects to it, right? But we became a nation of physical and economic assets expanding our territorial reach. So in 1803, the Louisiana Purchase doubled the size of the country. Okay, most early settlers to the United States were Protestant Christians. The Puritans lived primarily in New England. The Anglicans, who were later called Episcopalians, lived in Virginia. Roman Catholic immigrants lived in Maryland, and members of the Society of Friends, the Quakers, founded Pennsylvania. So this constantly increasing and changing religious diversity also plays in, and the ways that they mix together and move together also contribute to this changing geography. To the immigrants in the early 19th century, the land of the United States seemed pristine and undefiled. I'm not saying this is not problematic, right? But the perfect place to recover this pure, uncorrupted, and original Christianity, or that's how it was viewed. And the tradition-bound European churches seemed out of place in this new setting that seemed so fresh and possible. We're going to get into some of the problems too. Don't fret. So then the spirituality. Okay, so the spirituality of our movement was sort of contextually set within the Second Great Awakening. Now, the First Great Awakening happened in the 1730s, 1740s, and it was pulling away from ritual and ceremony, and it made Christianity intensely personal for the average person by fostering a deep sense of spiritual conviction and redemption, and by encouraging introspection and self-awareness and a commitment to a new standard of personal morality. The Second Great Awakening took place between 1790 and 1840. And this was a Protestant movement focused largely on unchurched people, people who didn't have a connection with the church. And it was largely democratic. It had this evangelical impulse that sort of pulsed through American religious life. And it was democratic in its politics. So heaven was democratized, okay? That heaven was a democracy. You know, it was possible for you to get there. And there was a large rejection of Calvinist thinking that there was an elect who made it to heaven. Instead, yeah, it was possible for anyone. Anyone could attain heaven. There was a hostility to creeds, hierarchy, and clergy. And there was this tension that you see brewing in this spiritual context between Calvinism, between those who are elect, those who are chosen, and democracy, that it's possible for anyone. And there was a reaction to a disillusionment with intellectualism and the rationalism of the Enlightenment. So there was a tension even there with some of the rationality that our movement was also based on. But the idea that common, ordinary people could become the leaders of this new religious movement and builders of a church and a denomination, even though they didn't set out to be a denomination, clearly, but that religious authority was refashioned after popular democracy. So it's connected contextually with the migration west and the fascination with American wilderness, with this idea of manifest destiny, which ultimately yielded the doctrine of discovery, which subjugated the native people of this place and created all kinds of evil embedded in our founding that we have to come to terms with now, because we didn't then. But during this time when the spirituality was happening, it was millions of people were enrolled into new and emerging churches, including what became the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. So many believe that this Second Great Awakening heralded the millennial age, particularly for people under the age of 25, particularly for women who made up a majority of the converts. Some estimate as many as 3 to 1. Religion became a way to shape their identities, to form community, to find support and meaning in a time of economic and personal insecurity, particularly on the frontier. A way for women to assert themselves in the face of male disapproval or expectations to submit to their husbands. So you see an emergence of women's prayer groups, and that was an early form of socially acceptable organization for women. And through their positions in these organizations, women played an important part in the development of society. outside of the domestic sphere. And so women played a crucial role in the development of churches, and particularly the Christian church, Disciples of Christ. Even if they rarely, if ever, held formal leading ministerial positions, at least early on. They did occasionally take on public roles during revivals. They preached or prayed, but they were less likely to be ordained or recognized as ministers. And just, Antoinette Brown Blackwell, who was a Congregationalist and later a Unitarian, she was the first ordained female minister in the United States. And if we were together, I would ask you, what year do you think that was? And you can guess or ask, but it was 1851. She was the very first ordained female ministers. Now, some noted effects of the Second Great Awakening. There was a decrease in Quakers, in Anglicans, and in Congregationalists, and there was an increase, particularly in the Presbyterians and the Baptists. And there was a rise in Black Protestantism, because this movement inspired slaves to demand freedom. In 1800, out of these Black revival meetings in Virginia, you had slave rebellions that would rise up, although often they were discovered and crushed before they could really get started. But despite white attempts to control independent Black congregations, especially after the Nat Turner Uprising of 1831, a number of Black congregations managed to maintain their separation as independent congregations in Baptist associations. Although, it's like this push-pull. State legislatures then passed laws requiring them to always have a white man present at their worship meetings. So you have this specter of oppression, even as there's this liberating impulse. But during the Second Great Awakening, religious schools, Bible study groups grew, developed. It was a way for social groups to grow and develop on the Western frontier. And it also set the stage for religious journalism, which was a way to keep connected, and church-related colleges that developed as a way to educate children and young people. The Second Great Awakening stimulated many reform movements designed to remedy the evils of society. And they wanted to do this, and they wanted to do it quickly, because Christ was coming. The second coming was coming quickly. It was coming now. We have to do it before that happens. And so you have this social activism that influenced abolition groups and women's rights groups and supporters of the temperance movement. And they began efforts to reform prisons and care for the handicapped and the mentally ill. And a lot of this was done by women. And it set the stage for the social gospel of the late 19th century. Converts were taught that to achieve salvation, they needed not just to repent of their personal sin, but also to work for the moral perfection of society. Now that may sound strange, but what they were trying to do is they were getting ready for Christ to come again, right? But what they were trying to do then was to cure all the ills in society, the poverty, the hunger, all of these things that actually are really positive, good things. And divisions arose between religious beliefs in the North and the South, largely because of this, because of the abolition movement. So some wanted to abolish slavery as part of this movement, particularly in the North, and there was great resistance, as we know, in the South. So Some of the currents of our church movement. You have Christians in the South, known as the Christian Connection. And James O'Kelly was one of the leaders, the primary leader in this movement. He lived from 1735 to 1826. He came from a blue blood family in England. In 1776, he hired a substitute to take his place in the Revolutionary War. He paid $300. He lived in Virginia and North Carolina, where the Church of England was the established church of the state from 1765 to 1775. Okay, notice it didn't go on after the Declaration of Independence. He was friends with Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry. At 42 years old, in 1777, he began preaching and became a Methodist lay preacher. Jefferson invited him to speak to the House of Representatives twice on the themes of liberty and freedom. He came into conflict with the Methodists, especially Francis Asbury, the Methodist superintendent, over the Methodist process, over ordination, and the structure of being a deacon, an elder, and then a superintendent. Asbury changed his own title to bishop and exercised ecclesial authority, including placing clergy in specific places with no appeal of appointment. O'Kelly didn't like this, and he questioned Asbury's authority and his leadership style and his control. In 1793, he led a schism of what he called Republican Methodists. It had 1,000 members and 30 preachers, and they seceded from the Methodist Church. In 1794, the Republican Methodists became the Christian Church. And some of the characteristics of this Southern Christian connection, that Jesus is the sole head of the church, not a superintendent. The Bible is the only guide. There is no predestination, so a rejection of Calvin. Congregational in polity, not episcopal, so there's no bishops, there's no superintendents, there's no presiding elders, and each church can call its own pastor. There was an equality among preachers, and preachers and lay people have full liberty to interpret the scriptures for themselves, and a great desire for unity. Then you have Elias Smith. Okay, he was in the North, the Christian Connection in the North. He lived from 1769 to 1846. He lived in a time when Vermont was considered the Western frontier. All right. He had a conversion experience when a log fell on him. Okay. A log fell on him and he came to Jesus. And his education, he had 13 days of grammar school, 10 days of arithmetic, 8 evenings learning music, and he studied a book of sermons. All right. After that, he was ordained in 1792 as a Baptist preacher. He was 23. He had a list of things he hated. Okay. Elias Smith hated Calvinism and predestination. He hated sprinkling. He hated the unbiblical Trinity. He hated the title Reverend. He hated sermon notes. He hated black clothing and state-supported churches and clergy. Okay? He hated all those things. 1804, though, he breaks with the Baptists. His goal was to restore the primitive New Testament church, to abandon all creeds. In 1808, he established the journal, the Herald of Gospel Liberty. And it existed from 1808 to 1931. He was considered the founder of religious journalism in America. In his first issue, he reprinted Barton Stone's Last Will and Testament of the Springfield Presbytery, which we'll get to in a minute. He was a Universalist Christian. Remember, he hated the Trinity, right? So he believed in one God, universalist, okay? So some of the characteristics of the Northern Christian Connection: no sermon notes, no reverend title, disapproved of instruments in church, no eyeglasses when preaching, okay? You preachers, no eyeglasses when preaching, no colored undergarments, and he might even check. And he believed in baptism by immersion. In 1811, Elias Smith came to seek a merger with the Southern Christian Connection, okay? But there was no merger at that time because they had differences over baptism. O'Kelly wanted sprinkling, Smith wanted immersion. In 1841, there was union between the Christians in the North. In 1841, they considered again the union between Christians in the North and the South. But then it's 1841. What do you think the difference was? There was no merger because then they differed over the issue of slavery. The Christian Connection continued after the 1832 merger of the Stone and Campbell groups. And eventually, this Christian Connection works into and becomes the United Church of Christ in 1957. Okay. Barton Stone and the Christians. Born in 1772 in Port Tobacco, Maryland, Barton Stone was baptized as an infant in the Church of England. His great-great-great-grandfather was the first Protestant governor of Maryland. His second cousin signed the Declaration of Independence. David Caldwell was a Presbyterian clergy person and his only teacher at the Caldwell Academy. And he was the person, David Caldwell was the person who converted Barton Stone to Christianity and deepened his faith. He planned to study law, but his conversion led him toward the ministry. In 1793, he becomes a candidate for the Presbyterian ministry, kind of like training and care. So he came into training and care in 1793. In 1794, though, he has theological problems with the Westminster Confession that God's eternal decree, that God is the author of sin. He struggles with this. The secret will of God, does that amount to God succeeds to damn some people? He really struggled with this. He had questions about atonement. He had questions about the Trinity. Stone believes in the salvation of all people and has distress and confusion about his ordination in the Presbyterian Church. So he tries to resist this calling. In 1796, he completes his theological exams and he is licensed. In 1797, he becomes a supply minister at Cane Ridge and in Concord, Kentucky. In 1798, he is ordained a Presbyterian minister at Cane Ridge. Now, this brings us to the fifth of those cultural contexts that I wanted to talk about. Tradition, okay? The Cane Ridge sacramental occasion, all right? Which also came to be understood as revival, all right? So most of the Scotch-Irish immigrants before the American Revolutionary War settled in the back country of Pennsylvania and down the spine of the Appalachian Mountains. That's where they settled, the Scots-Irish. And there were a number of camp meetings on the frontier, okay? The frontier being Kentucky. And a big camp meeting in 1792, in Tennessee in 1796, in Ohio in 1803. And all of these were steeped in Scottish Presbyterian roots, okay? The Scottish Presbyterians' most distinctive aspect was their communion service, which could be a 3 to 5 day affair. The communion service could last for 3 to 5 days. They believed, like all in this Calvinist tradition, okay, they were Presbyterian, so Calvinist, right? This is where they came from. They believed in the doctrine of the spiritual presence of Christ. And so at these sacramental occasions, there was a festive atmosphere. They were peak experiences. They were revivals. That's how we would understand them. There was an attitude of defiance. It could be quite wild, because people lived in isolation. And so they would come together for these camp meetings, and it was like this was their social outlet. And so they would last for several days, and they would gather with people from all around for this fellowship and worship. And there was an exhilaration of participating in a religious revival with crowds of hundreds and perhaps thousands of people when ordinarily you were alone. And so it inspired dancing and shouting, and all of this was associated with these events. There was great emotional power. On their return home, most of the people who were converted joined or created small local churches, which grew rapidly because they were so hungry for connection. And it demonstrated the need for churches and traditions to be somewhat flexible and to respond to the changing times and the changing atmosphere, to the geography, right? So in 1801, you had the Cane Ridge sacramental occasion. And who was the pastor? The Presbyterian pastor in Cane Ridge? Barton Stone, right? Barton Stone. The Cane Ridge sacramental occasion that took place in August of 1801 was an event on the Second Great Awakening. It was known as America's Pentecost. So located in northeastern Kentucky, the northeastern Kentucky wilderness, Cane Ridge became the site of the largest Protestant revival movement of the time, and inspired hundreds of similar revivals to spring up in its wake. Some estimate that there were about 25,000 people there. And it was led by the very charismatic Presbyterian preacher, Barton Stone. Although at any one time, there could be 7 people preaching all around, okay? And it was accompanied by some very bizarre manifestations of the Spirit. Of course, Stone describes falling and jerking and running and dancing and laughing and singing and barking. Some of the people were barking. And it brought on this spiritual revelation that became part of the context of the movement, the unity of spirit. And at the center of this event was the Lord's Supper, was communion. That was the centerpiece. So within the Presbyterian Church, however, they looked upon this Cane Ridge revival and they weren't so sure. I mean, these were some Presbyterians, right? They weren't so sure. I mean, they needed their Westminster Confession. They needed some of the structure. This was very unstructured. And so there was eventually this fissure that created an eventual split. Charges were brought against Stone's colleague, Richard McNamara, and Stone was questioned for dangerous and pernicious ideas. Okay. Primarily around the issue of their support for this ecstatic revival, their cooperation with other Christians, their doubts about Calvinism, about election and predestination. And so in 1803, the Friends of the Confession threatened to suspend them. And so 5 Presbyterian pastors withdrew from the Synod of Kentucky and formed the Springfield Presbytery, including Barton Stone. And they seceded based on the rejection of creeds, their commitment to the Bible, their desire for unity, their belief in universalism, salvation of all, but they didn't intend to start a new church. They just wanted to voice this difference, this movement, how the movement had changed and shaped them. Okay. So just a year later, after they had formed the Springfield Presbytery, they wrote in 1804 the last will and testament of the Springfield Presbytery, which, remember, was published in Elias Smith's journal. Okay. And in that last will and testament, okay, it's the will, okay, they write, "We will that this body die, be dissolved, and sink into union with the body of Christ at large. For there is but one body and one spirit, even as we are called in one hope of our calling." So they formed the Springfield Presbytery, and then they willed that it die because they didn't want to start a new church. They believed the millennium was coming anyway. Christ was coming back. It could be tomorrow. And they adopted the name Christians. They were very aware of the O'Kelly Christians and the Smith-Jones Christians, okay? They were very aware of those streams of Christianity. But unfortunately, that resistance movement didn't last altogether. In 1805, the next year, 2 of the 5 that seceded and formed the Springfield Presbytery returned to the Presbyterians. 2 others became Shakers, and Barton Stone, the lone holdout, began the Christian Messenger. He wrote his own journal, Committed to Unity. He is the one who focuses so heavily that, and you probably recognize this phrase, "Let unity be our polar star." And he advocated for plain dress for clergy, nothing fancy, none of them robes, evangelism. He opposed slavery, and he opposed masonry. So there you go. All right. There's the Cane Ridge Meeting House. Sorry, I missed that slide. The Campbells and the Reformers, or the Disciples. So this is another stream. Thomas Campbell lived from 1763 to 1854. Thomas Campbell was an Old Light, anti-burgher, seceder, Presbyterian. Now, there were many divisions of the Presbyterian Church of Thomas's day. In 1740, the moderates and evangelicals divided over who had the authority to appoint preachers. The seceders, which was Thomas Campbell, were the evangelicals who believed that individual churches had the authority to call their own preacher, not the Union Parliament. And then in 1747, the burgher and anti-burghers divided over whether the burgesses of towns were to take an oath to protect the religion of the state. The anti-burghers, Thomas Campbell, opposed the requirement of an oath. And another source of division arose in 1795 when the New Lights and the Old Lights divided over the power of civil magistrates in religion, as in the Westminster Confession. Thomas Campbell was a transitional figure, forming a link between the religious traditionalism of the old world, okay, he was Scottish, and the spirit and zeal of the new, right? He is a bridge from the old world's religion to the new world religion, okay? He migrated from Scotland to Pennsylvania. In 1807, in Washington County, Pennsylvania, he was called before the Presbyterian Synod on charges of teaching against creeds and confessions. So, in 1808, he was suspended, and then he said, "No, don't worry, I withdraw." In 1809, he forms the Christian Association of Washington, and he tried to form a union with the Presbyterian Synod of Pittsburgh, but he was rejected. Later, in 1809, he wrote the Declaration and Address of the Christian Association of Washington, which notably says the Church of Christ on earth is essentially, intentionally, and constitutionally one. He has a son, Alexander. He also he has many kids, and someone else, another child of his that is significant, and we'll talk about in a bit, is Jane Campbell McKeever. Alexander Campbell, probably the most well-known founder next to Barton Stone of our movement, lived from 1788 to 1866. He was educated at the University of Glasgow, where he was greatly influenced by Scottish Enlightenment philosophy and decided to withdraw from the Presbyterian Church. He also migrated at an early age, and he formed in 1811 the Brush Run Church, where his dad Thomas became the elder and Alexander was licensed to preach. Two primary and baptism by immersion. In 1815, the Brush Run Church united with the Redstone Baptist Association of Western Pennsylvania. In 1818, Alexander opened the Buffalo Seminary near Brush Run. In 1819, Thomas invited some blacks into the Buffalo Seminary to teach them how to read the Bible, how to read hymns, and he was notified that it was against state law to teach blacks unless one or two witnesses were in attendance. In 1823, Alexander Campbell began publishing the journal, The Christian Baptist, which was complete with anti-establishment rants against missionary societies, against creeds, against organ music, against choirs, against clergy, against clerical robes, against the title reverend, against church hierarchies, against fancy church buildings, against emotionalism, against revival meetings, against Presbyterian notions of conversion. They desired unity by restoring the primitive church. Are you noticing some currents? The Redstone Baptists believed the Campbells were not faithful teachers of the gospel. So they began to believe, these Baptists began to believe they were not faithful teachers of the gospel because there was no Philadelphia Confession. And they were furious about Alexander Campbell's Christian Baptist. So Alexander transferred his membership and joined the Mahoning Association. So switching allegiances to follow this belief, this desire for unity, this resistance to all these other things that they hated and couldn't stand. Okay. In 1826, Campbell asks Walter Scott to preach at the Mahoning Association. Now, Walter Scott is also known as one of the founders of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. He is very well known for his 5-finger exercise. based on Acts 2, verse 38. So the 5 fingers, all right, here they are. Faith, repentance, baptism, remission of sins, for forgiveness of sins, and the gifts of the Holy Spirit. Okay. In 1830, Alexander Campbell begins publishing the Millennial Harbinger, because Jesus is coming back at any moment, any day now. It's probably day after tomorrow. It's probably before the election. Eradicate earthly problems now. Usher in the millennial age and unity. Hurry up, convert the world. And he changed his mind about conventions and missionary societies. But he still no professional clergy. It was founded, it was rooted in freedom and rationality, in common sense religion that was both rational, reasonable, and practical. And then in 1840, he founded Bethany College. So the Christians and the disciples. Reason and liberty, which were championed by Campbell, married spiritual revelation, championed by Stone, shaped by equality and democracy, universality and divine inspiration, scriptural revelation, spiritual experience, rationalism, and evangelicalism. So some of the similarities between the Stone Christians and the Campbell disciples: they desired simple fellowship. They desired Christian unity, that Christ alone was the object of faith. They rejected limited atonement. Only a few get into heaven. They believed in baptism by immersion. Stone accepts this. He doesn't believe it's necessary. And they opposed creeds. Now, there were some differences about immersion. It was required by the disciples. It was optional by the Christians, by the nature of ministry. The disciples that had a Baptist influence had a lack of order, and that was the difference. And more orderly clergy and that were more respected was advocated by the Christians that had a Presbyterian influence, right? The conversion, the disciples had the 5-finger exercise. The Christians had no particular pattern. And communion, right? The disciples had closed but frequent communion. The Christians had open but less frequent communion. And then there was the difference over which was the more biblical name, Christians or disciples. In 1824, they met in Georgetown, Kentucky. In 1830, there were 10,000 disciples. There were 8,000 Christians. In 1831, they were discussing a merger. In 1832, there was a Stone and Campbell union. Part of how this was brokered was through Raccoon John Smith. His nickname was Raccoon. And I want to ask you why you think his name was Raccoon, but I'll just tell you it was because he was reportedly lived so remotely that his only neighbors were raccoons. So they called him Raccoon. He preached the first Unity sermon in 1832. Okay, between the Stone and Campbell, the Christians and the disciples. He said, "Let us then, my brethren, be no longer Campbellites or Stonites, new lights or old lights, or any other kind of lights, But let us come to the Bible, and to the Bible alone as the only book in the world that can give us all the light we need. So with this mentality, representing Campbell and the disciples, he shook the hand of Barton Stone, the representative of the Christians. All right. So what is the church's relationship with its social, economic, and political context? This is most certainly a question we wrestle with today, right? Certainly, from the earliest times, from the stories of these folks, these white men all, there is more diversity present than is acknowledged. Okay, where are the stories? Where are the voices? Where is the influence of the Blacks and the Indigenous Americans, the Hispanics, the Asians, all immigrants? We get some of it, and we get snippets, okay? But also our connection to manifest destiny and immigration and migration history. The belief that white superiority created an obligation and a responsibility to civilize and Christianize the rest of the world. Inculturation, the assimilating of others' values, and acculturation, modifying cultures based on prolonged contact, like an infant absorbs that knowledge. So you have, as part of our emergence, this notion of white man's burden, that this is something we have to do, that we have this duty to civilize and Christianize others, which leads us into trouble, which created things like the doctrine of discovery, where we are making laws that discriminate, that alienate, that dispossess others. You also have within our history, within our emergence, tension between unity and liberty that kind of create this fragmentation to our wholeness. So throughout our history, there's this fragile unity in the midst of this great sea of diversity. And our identity that's rooted in individualism and this pioneering spirit. So we're holding the tension between a reasonable and accessible faith, which was Campbell, championed by Campbell, and this emotional connection to God, which was championed by Stone. And we hold both of these things while we have this plea that's known as the plea of union in truth. There was, of course, throughout our history, the existence and the development of disciples of color, present at every stage of our history, and in the first century, right? Look back and we think, did that unity exist? So many of them wanted to go back to the primitive first century church. Well, what was that? What did that look like? And then you have the saying that's very familiar to us: in essentials, unity; in non-essentials, liberty. You have, again, liberty versus unity. And then you have the Civil War, right? And you think about liberty and unity and slavery versus abolition. And you have this call to pacifism, in which, and then the regional loyalties that seem to trump Christian motivation, We see that active even today. What is taking precedence over Christian motivation? And although Alexander Campbell had ardently argued for pacifism in 1848, the disciples made no dramatic witness during the Civil War and tended to conform to the prevailing views wherever they were in order to preserve unity. Right? Campbell evades the issue, but his sister, Jane Campbell McKeever, and some of his other siblings were active in the Underground Railroad, which begs the question, which is a question that I wrestle with in my ministry. I think it's very worthwhile for us to wrestle with as we think about our church and its development. Are political and social issues essential or non-essential to faith? Are they a matter of faith, or are they a matter of opinion? This was particularly in terms of slavery, right? Is it essential or non-essential to faith? Is it a matter of faith, or is it a matter of opinion? And the same could be said, not just for slavery, but immigration, racism, homophobia, any social issue. Is it a matter of faith or opinion? Is it essential or non-essential? Okay. So during Reconstruction, there was an ever-widening ideological gap between the North and the South. The North came out of the war in relatively good condition, and they began progress in terms of industry and technology and religion. Right? The South was under massive reconstruction. There was much less industry, and there was a great desire to hold on to a simple religious faith, which became a strict interpretation. There was a clinching down. Everything had been yanked away. So they were going to hold on to this, and we're going to squeeze the life out of it. So it became a much more literal interpretation of the Bible. Of course, there were economic issues that came into play. Who has access to resources and privilege? Whenever you ask that question, all you have to do is follow the money. Follow the money. There was intentional impoverishment of areas of the country. And then you had, with the social gospel, you had this burgeoning commitment to temperance. And so in 1901, you have the disciple, Carrie Nation, her hatchet, who goes in and breaks up the saloons and the bars. And there was also a great uncertainty about women's security. In 1906, okay, remember 1832, there was the merger. The disciples and the Christians. In 1906, there was a split that kind of came out of this Reconstruction. These intense differences that arose out of Reconstruction. And in this split, you had the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, because we couldn't decide on a name. So we took them both, Christian and Disciples. And they split with the Churches of Christ, the non-instrumental Churches of Christ. So the split with the Churches of Christ Independent, which we'll talk about later, came around restructure. And well, we don't have time to get into all that. Okay. So, but there were some philosophical, ideological differences that inform differences in beliefs around biblical interpretation, around mission societies, around slavery and instrumental music. So around biblical interpretation, how should we interpret the Bible? Thomas Campbell famously said, where the scriptures speak, we speak. Where the scriptures are silent, we are silent. Okay? But then the question arises, does silence mean prohibition, or does silence mean freedom? Or are you meant to use common sense? One clue in this conversation is the language of Reformation versus Restoration. Reformation emphasizes inclusiveness, liberty, unity, and toleration. Restoration emphasizes exclusiveness, restrictions, independence, attention to the minutiae of the ancient order. If the scripture does not specifically condone an action, then it should be prohibited. What is condoned should be only what is absolutely necessary. So you have the restorationists. The societies and instruments are not absolutely necessary. And so they are prohibited as unbiblical, heretical, schismatical, just like creeds and confessions. So if the Bible doesn't say you can play organs, which of course it doesn't, then you can't. And then you have the missionary societies. In 1847, the American Christian Missionary was founded, and this was also a source of consternation. And of course, then in 1861, at the front end of the Civil War, the American Christian Missionary Society had a national convention in Cincinnati, in which no one from the South was represented. And they resolved to support the Union, of course, because there was no other point of view. And great consternation and great anger. The churches in the South weren't having it. And then, of course, the issues, the controversy around instrumental music. Okay. It began around 1864, and it included the economics of the Reconstruction. The churches in the South simply could not afford instruments, so they made that into a good thing. They made that into a benefit. Well, yeah, we can't afford it, but it's prohibited anyway. Because was there evidence in the first century of instruments like organs? No. But then again, did Jesus reject the instrument? Is it a matter of fact? Is it a matter of faith or opinion? Okay. So these were some of the issues of the separation in 1906. Now you also have, okay, in around restructure of the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, you have another split, right? So you have the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, the Churches of Christ, non-instrumental, which we've just been talking about, and the churches and the Christian Church, independence. Okay. Now, we don't have time to get into all detail, right? But I did want to have this in this presentation so that you could go back, I guess, and reference it. It's very useful in terms of how they are different and how these splits then, how we're related and how we're not related. Just in a nutshell, I'll just go through some of our, the Christian Church disciples, characteristics. In terms of church government, there's self-governing congregations aligned with policies of a national general board. Baptism is by immersion only, but congregations are free to accept members baptized in other ways. Now, just notice how that's different from the Churches of Christ, non-instrumental and independent, okay? There's a delegated General Assembly for business as well as fellowship and inspiration. And just notice how that's different. There are organized boards to do the work of the church. The Bible contains the divine revelation of God's will. The spirit rather than the letter is stressed. Okay. In terms of worship, liturgical forms are often followed. Weekly open to all. In terms of the purpose of our church, unity of the Christian world is paramount. Okay, it's sought by any. I would say that's generally true. We could argue that point, couldn't we? Just like disciples do. And in terms of ecumenicism, right? There's a full cooperation with other denominations, seeking ecumenical ideals. And just notice some of these differences. These were the reasons that the church split. One of the reasons, missionary societies, right? It is a focus of disciples' identity, but what is the purpose and the goal of mission work? Why do we do it? Where and who is the mission field? Which then goes back to, what is the role of the church? And then we could talk about in terms of dominant culture, right? Assimilation, patriotism, integration, autonomy, support. What role of the church? How can the church minister effectively if people are considered inferior? Now, that notion has motivated a lot of mission work throughout history. That, however, is not the motivator of disciples' mission work today. But if we look back, okay, so in 1849, we have Disciples' First National Convention in Cincinnati and the Charter of the American Christian Missionary Society. Okay. Alexander Campbell was made president, which isn't that interesting. At one point, he was so adamantly against them. And then here he is, the first president. And it was very controversial and it was very influential. And then notice, this I find so fascinating. In 1851, we sent our first missionary. And where do we send that missionary? To Jerusalem, because of course, don't they need to be evangelized? So strange, so funny. And then our second missionary, we sent a Black man for the purpose of mission work in Africa, in Liberia. So also interesting choices and how that happened. And then just to notice, in 1874, you have the Christian Women's Board of Mission. And that was headed up by Carolyn Neville Pierre, which is, she was very significant leader in our history. In 1875, the Foreign Christian Missionary Society, Barrett was president. He later became part of one of the break-off groups. In 1875, the Southern Christian Institute, which chartered a school in Mississippi to offer education and trade skills to Blacks. In 1887, the National Benevolent Association was founded to consolidate charitable efforts in the United States. In 1917, you have the National Christian Missionary Convention, which establishes the autonomy of the Black disciples' churches. And Preston Taylor was its leader, not to function as a separatist movement, but to address specific needs and concerns, right? He is noted for saying the disciples of Christ, strange as it may seem, need the colored people, if for no other reason as the acid test of Christian orthodoxy and willingness to follow the Christ all of the way in his program of human redemption. For if the white brother can include in his religious theory and practice the colored people as real brothers, he will have avoided the heresy of heresies. In 1919, the United Christian Missionary Society was formed to consolidate the mission work among disciples. So it consolidates the ACMS, the CWBM, and the FCMS, right? In 1944, the National Christian Missionary Society expanded partnership with the United Christian Missionary Society. In 1969, the NCMC merges with the larger disciples body. In 1970, the Division of Overseas and the Homeland Ministries incorporated separately from the Christian Missionary Society. And then in 1996, the Common Ministries Board was formed in partnership fully with the United Church of Christ. That's a lot of stuff, okay? That's a lot of stuff, but we're going to keep going. Okay. I will say this about the global ministries, about our global ministries as it exists today. It is responsive to requests from churches in the places that it serves. It is not a body that goes in to evangelize and convert. It is entirely committed to serving human dignity and freedom and economic justice as concerns of faith, supporting indigenous forms of worship and leadership and organization and theology. So our work is responsive to the needs that are present in places where we have partners. And missionaries who go to serve in these places with our partners are often financed by ecumenical pools of money and resources, so that we are in partnership and we are accountable to a wide body of people. Okay. Now, in terms of polity, in terms of our ecclesiastical polity, there are three forms, right? There are three forms of polity. There's episcopal polity, which local churches by bishops. You see this primarily in Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, Oriental Orthodox, and Anglican churches. It's also common in some Methodist, Lutheran, African American, Pentecostal traditions. Many Methodist churches use a derivative of episcopal polity, which combines a loose episcopal hierarchy with a bottom-up structure made up of small groups of congregations called circuits. But that's episcopal polity. And then you have Presbyterian polity, where local churches are governed by a hierarchy of councils. It's characteristic of Presbyterian churches and other churches in the Reformed tradition. Elements of Presbyterian polity are also found in churches such as the Episcopal Church in the United States, where governance by bishops is paralleled by a system of deputies. And then you have congregational polity. Local congregations govern themselves, right? They may appoint leaders and councils, but there are no hierarchical positions such as bishop as a requirement of church structure. Ministers may preside over congregations, but they do not the congregations. The congregations have the final authority. Okay. Examples of this are the disciples, the Congregationalists, the Baptists, and non-denominational churches. And part of our ethos, our theology, our practice is this commitment to the priesthood of all believers. The first century pastoral described ordinary folk who were chosen among the rank and file in the first century to be leaders and were given titles including elder and deacon. So gradually through history, this informal ministry was replaced with a formalized order of clergy, which, as you heard, was resisted strongly by many of our founders, right? Because we don't want those clergy to get too high and mighty, because there is, after all, a priesthood of all believers. But there was a recognition that there was a need for a responsible, professional, specialized, educated, and trained clergy, equipped specifically for this kind of work. So you have the founders of the disciples movement that have a disdain for dominating, distrust of authority, belief in congregational freedom, aversion to ecclesiastical authority. And so pastors and laity walk this line between clerical order and clerical anarchy. And ultimately, it comes down to declaring the distinction between clergy and laity is a matter of degree, not kind. We're all priesthoods. We are the priesthood of all believers. It's a matter of degree, not kind. The early reformers empowered laity to administer the Lord's Supper, to teach, to preach, to serve as elder. All of these are serious matters for disciples. We take that very seriously. It's not just the minister who can do those things. Every Christian enters into the corporate ministry of God's people. In addition, the church recognizes an order of the ministry set apart under God to equip the whole people to fulfill ministry. The restructure of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ took place between 1962 and 1968. Okay, this is when the independent Christian churches and the Christian Church Disciples of Christ went their separate ways. Renewal is not just change. It is bringing the results of change into line with the continuity of our mission as the church. This is why we refer to restructure and renewal as a process. It is an weaving of continuity and change concerning meaningful aspects of a rich and enduring, but realizing it must be a tradition facilitating its own continuity. So this was our second general minister, Kenneth T. Garden, in 1965. Okay. This period marks the official split with the Christian churches independent primarily over the issues of the United Christian Missionary Society, which means baptism and what baptism is recognized, the theology of mission, what the purpose of mission work is, and church structure. It resulted in a covenantal design rather than a formal constitution of the church. So there's no pyramid of authority, there's no top or bottom. It provided a way for the three expressions of the church to be voluntarily joined in covenant with one another and with God, characterized by mutual interdependence, mutual sustenance, mutual responsibility, protection of each expression's integrity. The provisional design was adopted in 1968 and successfully amended in 1969, in 1971, in 1973, in 1975, in 1977 when the word provisional was dropped, and then again in 1983, and 1985, and 1995, and 2005 when there were significant revisions. Now all this speaks to the evolving of who we are, the flexibility that's built into our movement, the commitment to growth and development, and the commitment to covenant, that we are in covenant and there can be change. It is not once and for all, forever. The nature of the church given by Christ remains constant, yet the structures of the church continue to adapt in order to meet the needs and patterns of a world with faithfulness, So there are three expressions of the church, okay? And these are what are mutually interdependent, okay? You have congregational, regional, and general expressions of the church. So early attempts at cooperation among congregations were associational in character, which limited their effectiveness in creating programs of scale and range. And we want to affect change in the world, right? So we created these covenantal interdependent relationships, and the nations evolved to help congregations with one another more fully in the broader purpose of the church. The congregational expression has the right to manage its own affairs, own and control its own property, constitute its own corporate organizational structure and name, call its own minister, set its own finances, participate through chosen representatives, corporate judgments of the total church. The congregational expression has responsibility to administer baptism and the Lord's Supper, to sustain and minister faithfully and with honor, to exercise effective stewardship in the work of the total church, and to view the church as a universal fellowship. The regional expression of the church has missional responsibilities to develop the development of a sensitive comprehension of human needs beyond the congregation, leading in discovery of new forms of ministerial witness, leading in pursuit of ecumenical means to fulfill mission. And it has nurturing responsibilities as well. The development of a sensitive, to certify the standing of ministers, providing accountability, pastoral care for ministers and congregations, seeing the process of ordination and relocation for ministers, assisting each congregation to relate to the general expression of the church. And then you have the general expression, which attempts to reflect wholeness and unity. Through the General Assembly, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ can speak to the world with one voice on socioeconomic concerns and human needs, oversee the work of the church's respective ministries, and lay a foundation for working with bodies in fulfilling a common mission of witness and service. I'm going to go back here. So we have general units, right? Some of you may and I'll just go through them quickly. The Council on Christian Unity, Church Extension, including the Hope Partnership, Higher Education and Leadership Ministry, or HELM, the Pension Fund, the Christian Church Foundation, Christian Church Homes, Week of Compassion, the National Benevolent Association, Disciples Home Missions, the National Convocation, the Central Pastoral Office for Hispanic Ministries, NAPAD, the Disciples of Christ Historical Society, the Division of Overseas Ministries, and the Christian Board of Publication, which I'm I'm not sure its status at the moment, but and then you have undergraduate and theological institutions of the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ. I won't read, but these are significant. This is a significant legacy and continuing ministry of our church. Very significant. And then we have partnerships and ecumenical partnerships. Unity continues to be an intense passion. The polar star of unity, the intense passion for education and individual expressions of faith. There is a quest for unity through common aspects of faith, unity through our humanity, unity in freedom, unity that celebrates diversity, unity linked to prophetic witness and service. There is a long heritage of openness to other Christian traditions, having come into existence as a 19th century movement against denominational exclusiveness. That's how we came into being. So at the local level and beyond, disciples are frequently involved in cooperative and ecumenical work. In 1907, for charter member of the Federal Council of Churches, now the National Council of Churches. We've even provided leadership, national leadership in that over time. In 1910, we were part of the Commission of Christian Union, which now is the Council on Christian Unity, another one of our general units. In 1910, the disciples established the Council on Christian Unity, first denomination in the world to have an organization devoted to the pursuit of Christian unity. In 1948, we became a charter member of the World Council of Churches. In 1950, a charter member of the National Council of Churches. Disciples helped organize the National and World Council of Churches. In 1989, we entered into full communion with the United Church of Christ, declared that a relationship of full communion now exists between two churches, and that ecumenical partnership rests on 5 pillars of acceptance and cooperation: a common confession, mutual members, common celebration of the Lord's Supper, Holy Communion, mutual recognition and reconciliation of ordained ministries, and common commitment to mission. Joint work between the Disciples Division of Overseas Ministry and the United Church of Christ wider church ministries, formerly, well, doesn't matter, cooperation in 1967. But the board was established in 1996. So we have ecumenical partners in ministry, and that is ongoing. All committed to unity rather than uniformity, allowing this but not disunity. And these are important things to remember when we feel so divided as we do in this moment in time. We have ecumenical relationships that are officially recognized. These are some of them. I don't need to read them. I'll just let you read them. Goodness, we're at 8:30. And I have other things, but you know what? There's some questions, and I don't know if there's a way, if you have questions you would like to ask, things that I didn't cover or didn't cover enough, or questions that were raised. There is a question and answer button for you to click down there. I will just say some things worth wrestling with as we leave tonight, and as we go to the next days and weeks and months ahead. Are political and social issues essential or non-essential to faith? And how do you know? Are they a matter of faith or opinion? How do you know? What qualities characterize disciples' commitments to mission and service? Especially in terms of mission, is the role of the church to evangelize individuals or to engage in efforts to transform social environments? And what makes you believe that? Where is that rooted in you? Understanding, your emerging understanding, because we're all emerging, of identity.